The morning sun cast long shadows across the cornfields as I walked toward the farmhouse, my boots crunching on the gravel path I'd walked 1,000 times before. The air was crisp with that early autumn bite that always reminded me why I loved this place so much. 28 years I'd spent on this land, first as a child running between the rows of corn, then as a teenager learning to drive the old John Deere, and finally as a man who'd poured his heart and soul into every acre. Mom was waiting on the porch, her face set in that expression I'd learned to dread over the years. She held a manila envelope in her hands, and I could see the legal documents peeking out from the top. The weight of whatever news she carried seemed to press down on her shoulders, making her look older than her 62 years. I'd been expecting this conversation for months, ever since Dad passed away last spring. The farm had been struggling financially, and I knew the bank had been calling more frequently, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that came out of her mouth next. "This farm isn't your home anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned, everything I'd dreamed of passing down to my own children someday, it was all being stripped away in that single sentence. I stood there in stunned silence, watching as she extended the envelope toward me. My hands shook as I took it, though whether from anger or grief I couldn't tell. Inside were the eviction papers, cold and official, giving me 30 days to vacate the only home I'd ever known. Chapter 2. Packing a Lifetime. The next few hours passed in a blur of disbelief and mechanical action. I found myself in the old barn, staring at the tools that had belonged to my father and his father before him. Each implement told a story. The worn handle of the splitting maul, smoothed by decades of use, the old hand plow that Grandpa had used to break the original ground, the collection of wrenches and screwdrivers that had fixed more machinery than I could count. My hands moved without conscious thought, wrapping each tool carefully in old newspapers and placing them in cardboard boxes. The weight of each item seemed magnified, as if I were handling pieces of my own soul. The smell of motor oil and hay dust filled my nostrils, a scent that had always meant home to me. As I worked, memories flooded back. I could almost hear Dad's voice echoing in the rafters, teaching me the proper way to maintain a tractor engine. I could see Grandpa's weathered hands, showing me how to sharpen a scythe blade until it gleamed like silver. These weren't just tools. They were inheritance, tradition, the physical manifestation of generations of hard work and dedication. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn doors, creating golden rectangles of light that danced with dust motes. I paused in my packing, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was losing. This wasn't just about a piece of property or a business venture. This was about identity, about belonging, about the continuation of a legacy that stretched back 4 generations. With each tool I packed away, I felt like I was dismantling not just a collection of equipment, but the very foundation of who I was. The question that haunted me wasn't just where I would go, but who I would become without this land to define me. Chapter 3. The Weight of Leaving. The old pickup truck sat in the driveway, loaded down with everything I could fit. Boxes of tools, a few pieces of furniture, and a handful of personal belongings that somehow seemed inadequate to represent an entire lifetime. The rest would have to be sold or left behind, another painful reminder of how quickly a life could be reduced to what fit in the back of a Ford F-150. I took one last walk around the property, my feet following the familiar paths without conscious direction. Past the vegetable garden that Mom had tended for 30 years, where tomatoes still hung heavy on the vine, unpicked and slowly rotting in the autumn air. Past the old oak tree where Dad had hung a tire swing when I was 7, its rope now frayed and grey with age. The fields stretched out before me, 180 acres of some of the richest soil in the county. Corn stood ready for harvest, the stalks tall and heavy with grain that I would never gather. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was shaping up to be one of the best yields we'd had in years, and I wouldn't be here to see it brought in. Standing at the edge of the property line, I turned back to look at the farmhouse one more time. The white clapboard siding needed paint, and the front porch sagged slightly on the left side, but it was beautiful to me in a way that no mansion could ever be. This was where I'd taken my first steps, spoken my first words, learned what it meant to work with my hands and care for something bigger than myself. The engine of the pickup turned over with a reluctant growl, as if even the truck was reluctant to leave. I put it in drive and pulled away slowly, watching the farm shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a stand of maple trees. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was leaving everything that mattered behind. Chapter 4. A Night of Questions. The motel room was everything the farm wasn't. Sterile, impersonal, filled with the smell of industrial carpet cleaner and someone else's cigarette smoke. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The silence was deafening after a lifetime of falling asleep to the sound of wind through cornstalks and the distant lowing of cattle. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of ploughing fields and fixing fences, only to wake up to the harsh reality of orange polyester curtains and a broken air conditioning unit that rattled like a dying engine. Each time I drifted off, I found myself back on the farm, only to have the dream dissolve when consciousness returned. I'd called my Uncle Jim that evening, hoping he might have some insight into Mom's decision, or perhaps offer a couch to sleep on while I figured out my next move. But his phone went straight to voicemail, and I didn't have the energy to leave a message that would somehow capture the enormity of what had happened. The questions came in waves throughout the night. How had the financial situation gotten so bad so quickly? Why hadn't Mom talked to me about options before making such a drastic decision? Had she tried to get loans or look into government programs that might have helped us keep the farm? And underneath all the practical questions was the deeper, more painful one. How could she give up something that meant so much to our family's history? By 3 in the morning, I was sitting by the window, looking out at the parking lot and the highway. Beyond, watching the occasional semi-truck roll past with a whoosh of displaced air. Each set of headlights reminded me of how alone I felt, how disconnected from everything that had once anchored my life. Chapter 5. Morning brings determination. Dawn came grey and overcast, matching my mood as I checked out of the motel and drove aimlessly through the county roads. I wasn't ready to leave the area entirely. Not yet. Something kept pulling me back toward the farm, even though I knew I couldn't stay there. Maybe it was just the need to see it one more time in the morning light, or maybe I was hoping that somehow the whole thing had been a terrible nightmare. I parked at the end of our old driveway and walked back toward the house, careful to stay on the county road so I wouldn't technically be trespassing on what was no longer my property. The corn rustled in a light breeze, and I could hear the sound of machinery in the distance, probably the Hendersons getting an early start on their harvest. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I needed answers, and I needed them from someone other than Mom. If the farm was really gone, if there was truly no way to save it, then I needed to understand how we'd gotten to this point. But more than that, I needed to know if there was anything at all that could be done. The county courthouse was the imposing brick building that had been the center of local government for over a century. I'd driven past it countless times, but had never had reason to go inside. The marble floors echoed with my footsteps as I made my way to the land records office, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed to sense my distress. When I explained what I was looking for, she nodded sympathetically and led me to a computer terminal where I could search property records. My hands shook slightly as I typed in the farm's address, not knowing what I might find, but knowing I had to look. Chapter 6. Searching for Truth. The computer screen glowed with lines of legal text that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Property transfers, mortgage records, tax assessments, all the dry official documentation of what had once been a living, breathing piece of family heritage. I scrolled through years of records trying to piece together the financial history of the farm. What I found made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The mortgage had been refinanced 3 times in the last 5 years, each time at higher interest rates and with more stringent terms. There were liens I'd never heard of, medical bills that must have been related to Dad's final illness, and a series of late payment notices that painted a picture of a family struggling to stay afloat. But it was the most recent entry that caught my attention and refused to let go. A property transfer document dated just 2 weeks ago, showing the farm had been sold to pay outstanding debts. The new owner was listed as Riverside Development LLC, a name that meant nothing to me but somehow felt ominous in its corporate sterility. I printed out everything I could, feeding quarters into the machine with hands that had steadied somewhat as my shock transformed into determination. There had to be more to this story, more pieces to the puzzle that I wasn't seeing. The clerk helped me understand some of the legal terminology, explaining what the various documents meant in plain English. As I gathered up the papers, she mentioned something that made me pause. "You know," she said quietly, "if you're family, you might want to check the grantor index too. Sometimes there are other documents filed that don't show up in the basic property search." I didn't know what a grantor index was, but I was willing to try anything. She showed me how to search for any documents where my family name appeared as the person granting or transferring property rights. What appeared on the screen made me sit down heavily in the nearest chair. Chapter 7. Grandfather's Shadow. There it was, in black and white on the glowing screen. A document I'd never known existed, filed just 1 month before my grandfather's death 15 years ago. The language was dense and legal, but the meaning was clear enough once I worked through it. Grandpa had set up what the document called a reversionary interest in the farm property. My hands trembled as I read through the details. According to this document, if the farm was ever sold due to financial distress or if certain conditions were met, ownership would revert not just to any family member, but specifically to me. The language was specific and carefully crafted, clearly the work of a lawyer who understood property law far better than I did. I read the document 3 times, each pass revealing new details that made my heart race. Grandpa had apparently anticipated the possibility that the farm might face financial difficulties, and he'd created a legal mechanism to ensure it stayed in family hands. The document referenced my demonstrated commitment to agricultural use of the property and my blood relationship to the original homesteader. But there was a catch. There always was. The reversionary interest was only valid if claimed within 30 days of the triggering event. The sale to Riverside Development LLC qualified as such an event, which meant I had less than 2 weeks left to file the necessary paperwork to invoke the provision. The clerk was as surprised as I was when I showed her what I'd found. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted, adjusting her glasses to read the fine print. "You'll need a lawyer to help you understand exactly what your rights are under this document. This is way beyond what I can advise you on." I left the courthouse with a folder full of documents and the first glimmer of hope I'd felt since leaving the farm. Grandpa had been gone for 15 years, but somehow he was still looking out for the land he'd loved and the family who'd worked it. The question now was whether his legal foresight could overcome the corporate machinery that had already taken possession of our home. Chapter 8. Racing Against Time. The law office was tucked between the insurance agency and a barbershop on Main Street, the kind of small-town practice that handled everything from wills to traffic tickets. Margaret Chen, the attorney I'd managed to get an appointment with on short notice, was younger than I'd expected, but had the kind of focused intensity that gave me confidence she knew what she was doing. She spread Grandpa's documents across her desk, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad as she worked through the complex language. Her expression grew more animated as she read, and I found myself leaning forward in my chair, trying to read her reaction. "This is remarkable," she finally said, looking up at me with something approaching excitement. "Your grandfather created what amounts to a family trust with very specific triggering conditions. It's actually quite sophisticated. Whoever drafted this really knew property law. She explained that the reversionary clause was legally binding and would likely hold up in court, but there were procedures that had to be followed exactly. I would need to file a formal claim, provide documentation of my relationship to the original property owner, and demonstrate that the triggering conditions had been met. The challenge, she continued, is that Riverside Development has already taken possession and may have started making improvements or changes to the property. That could complicate things, but it doesn't invalidate your claim if we can prove they were aware of the reversionary interest. We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every piece of evidence, building what she called an airtight case. She would file the initial paperwork that afternoon, and we'd have a court hearing within the week. It would cost me most of my savings, but for the first time since leaving the farm, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just accepting defeat. As I left her office, Margaret called after me. "Your grandfather must have loved that farm very much to go to all this trouble. He was protecting it for you long before you probably even knew you'd want it." Chapter 9. Confronting the present. I drove back to the farm that evening, this time pulling into the driveway with a sense of purpose instead of despair. The house was dark, but I could see lights on in what had been my workshop, and there were 2 vehicles I didn't recognize parked near the barn. Corporate efficiency was already at work, I realized. Riverside Development wasn't wasting any time. A man in a business suit emerged from the barn as I parked, followed by someone in work clothes carrying a clipboard. They approached my truck with the confident stride of people who believed they owned everything they could see. "Can I help you?" the suited man asked, though his tone suggested he was more interested in helping me leave than anything else. I introduced myself and explained my connection to the property, watching his expression shift from polite confusion to something harder. He identified himself as a project manager for Riverside Development and made it clear that he considered me a trespasser. "I understand you might have emotional attachments to this property," he said, "but we purchased it through proper legal channels. We have work to do here, and we can't have unauthorized people interfering with our operations." I could have mentioned the legal documents I'd found, the reversionary clause that might change everything, but something held me back. Instead, I asked what they were planning to do with the land. His answer made my blood run cold. "Residential development," he said matter-of-factly. 42 single-family homes, plus a small commercial area. "We'll break ground as soon as we get the environmental assessments completed." 42 houses where corn had grown for 4 generations. A strip mall where my grandfather had built his first barn with his own hands. The magnitude of what would be lost hit me like a physical blow, and I had to fight to keep my voice steady as I thanked him for his time and walked back to my truck. Chapter 10. The battle begins. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb the fluorescent lighting and create an atmosphere of somber authority. Margaret sat beside me at a table covered with documents, her professional calm helping to steady my nerves as we waited for the hearing to begin. Across the aisle, Riverside Development had brought what appeared to be a small army of lawyers, all in identical dark suits carrying matching briefcases. The message was clear: they had resources, and they intended to use them. But Margaret had assured me that legal intimidation tactics were often just that, tactics, and that our case was strong regardless of how many lawyers they'd hired. The judge was an older man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent time outdoors before taking the bench. As he reviewed the documents we'd filed, I found myself studying his expression for any hint of how he might rule. Margaret presented our case methodically, walking through Grandpa's reversionary clause, the documentation proving my relationship to the property, and the evidence that the triggering conditions had been met. She spoke clearly and confidently, painting a picture of a family with deep roots in the land, and a grandfather who'd had the foresight to protect that legacy. Riverside's lead attorney countered by arguing that the reversionary clause was too vague to be enforceable, that too much time had passed since its creation, and that their client had purchased the property in good faith without knowledge of any encumbrances. He spoke about economic development, job creation, and the greater good served by converting agricultural land to residential use. As I listened to the legal arguments flying back and forth, I realized that what we were really fighting about was two completely different visions of what land meant. To Riverside, it was a commodity to be developed for maximum profit. To my family, it was home, heritage, and identity rolled into one irreplaceable package. Chapter 11, Waiting for Justice. The judge retired to his chambers to consider the arguments, leaving us to wait in the hallway outside the courtroom. Margaret seemed confident but cautioned me that these decisions could go either way, especially when corporate interests and individual rights collided. I found myself thinking about Grandpa during those long minutes of waiting. He'd been a quiet man, not given to grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but he'd had a deep understanding of people and an almost mystical connection to the land. That he'd anticipated this exact situation 15 years ago seemed almost supernatural, as if he'd been able to see into the future and prepare for battles he wouldn't live to fight. The development team's lawyers clustered at the other end of the hallway, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing in our direction. One of them was on a phone call that seemed increasingly agitated, though I couldn't make out the words. Margaret noticed my attention and smiled slightly. "Corporate lawyers hate uncertainty," she said quietly. "They're probably calling their clients to explain that this might not be as simple as they thought." When the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The judge had a stack of papers in front of him and an expression that gave nothing away. He looked directly at me as he began to speak. "The court has reviewed all submitted documents and arguments," he said, in a voice that carried the weight of years on the bench. "This case presents an interesting intersection of property law, family heritage, and economic development." He paused, and in that silence I felt like my entire future hung in the balance. Everything I'd ever worked for, everything my family had built, everything Grandpa had tried to protect. It all came down to whatever words came next. Chapter 12, The Moment of Truth. The judge's next words changed everything. "The court finds that the reversionary clause created by the property's previous owner is legally valid and properly executed. The defendant's claim of good faith purchase is undermined by the fact that these documents were properly filed and available for public inspection." I felt Margaret's hand on my shoulder as the judge continued, but the words seemed to come from very far away. He was ruling in our favor. The farm would be returned to family ownership. Riverside Development would have to seek their compensation from whoever had sold them property they didn't have clear title to. The corporate lawyers were already packing up their briefcases, their expressions grim but professional. This was just another business setback for them, I realized. But for me, it was the difference between having a future and losing everything that defined who I was. As we walked out of the courthouse, Margaret explained the practical next steps. There would be paperwork to file, possession to regain, and probably some cleanup to do where Riverside had begun their assessments. But the farm was mine again, protected by my grandfather's wisdom and foresight. The afternoon sun felt different as I drove back toward home, warmer somehow, more welcoming. The cornfields looked the same, but everything else had changed. I wasn't a displaced person anymore, wasn't someone who'd lost his heritage to corporate machinery and family financial struggles. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, just looking at the farmhouse that would be mine again within days. The white clapboard siding still needed paint, and the front porch still sagged slightly on the left side, but it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. That evening, I called Mom for the first time since leaving. Her voice was thick with emotion when I told her about Grandpa's reversionary clause and the court's decision. "He never told me," she whispered. "All these months I thought we'd lost everything, and he'd been protecting us all along." Chapter 13. Coming Home. 3 days later, I loaded my tools back into the old barn, unwrapping each one carefully and returning it to its proper place. The splitting maul went back on its hook near the workbench. The hand plough was restored to its spot against the north wall. Each tool seemed to settle into place with a satisfaction that matched my own. The house felt different when I walked through it that first morning back. Not just like I was visiting, but like I truly belonged there again. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. The familiar creaks and sounds of the old building seemed like a welcoming song. I stood on the front porch, looking out over the acres that were mine again, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just about owning property. It was about being a steward of something that had been entrusted to me by generations past and would hopefully be passed on to generations future. The corn was ready for harvest, and I had work to do. Real work, meaningful work, the kind that connected me to the land and to the long line of family members who'd worked this same soil before me. As I walked toward the barn to check on the equipment, I could almost feel Grandpa's presence, his approval of a job well done and a legacy preserved. Mum came by that afternoon, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. We stood together in the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, where family decisions had been made and celebrations held. The farm was whole again, and so were we. The harvest that fall was everything I'd hoped it would be, abundant, profitable, and deeply satisfying in a way that went far beyond financial considerations. Each ear of corn represented not just income, but continuity. Each day spent in the fields was a day spent honoring the trust that Grandpa had placed in me before I was even old enough to understand what it meant. As winter approached and the fields lay dormant under a blanket of snow, I found myself making plans for the spring planting, for improvements to the barn, for all the projects that would make this place even better for the next generation. The farm had been saved, but more than that, it had been given new life and purpose. Thank you for listening to this story of family, heritage, and the power of never giving up on what matters most. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me where in the world you're listening from, and if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps ensure that stories like this one continue to be told.